I was sitting on the front porch of a house in Saudi Daisy with Alvin Schwartz. Sometime before, back in 1973, he had killed a woman. According to the woman's sister, he shot her 3 times in the head and then buried the body as if she were a bag of garbage. We searched for her for nearly 4 months before a hunter's dog dug her up. Well, Al Schwartz was having marital problems with his wife, Brenda. My wife, Jeanette, was with Brenda elsewhere. They were inside the house, probably in the kitchen, which is now my kitchen where I've lived for some time. And she was counseling Brenda about the duty and the needs and the beauty of marriage. Brenda had put a classified ad in the Chattanooga Free Press, probably in the Chattanooga Times as well, the Chattanooga News Free Press, as it was called then, and had put our house on the market for maybe about $86,000. And we were looking for a house at the time. We had just gotten married and had 1 child, a daughter, Abigail, who's now 25. And we're looking for a house that was something that would fit our budget and would be in what we would estimate as a good location. So there we were at the house of Al and Brenda Schwartz. She worked in the motor department of city government, somehow tending to buses. She had mechanics or administrative skills. And I'm not sure what Al did, but there he sat. I think he smoked a cigarette sitting on the front porch where now my office, my home office has its own little porch with a rocking chair on it. And there he sat on this mountain stone covered house that had been added to on the far side where the living room and the bedroom are in a kind of a tower. And then on this side, in which we sat, where there was the office and then a garage, all had been added to what was once a very short snub-nosed rancher house on a hill in some woods in North County. That's where I live today. And Al Schwartz, who had kidnapped and killed a woman in 1973, was listening to my suggestions about marriage. I was saying, well, marriage is God's instrument for man's benefit. And Brenda had put the ad in the paper because she was wanting a divorce. And Jeanette was arguing for them staying together and not putting the house in the market. And I was doing the same thing. I was talking to him in an encouraging way about loving your wife as yourself, loving your wife as Christ loved the church. That the church is unfaithful, the church is besmirched, the church is sinful. She is nonetheless Christ's bride. And Christ died for her and made the great sacrifice of life and his blood and his perfection on the cross, taking on the burden of the sin of all of his people, right? The sin of all of his people from the very first man, Adam, to the last man on the earth or woman on the earth. He has died for and will have died for each one of them. And so in that vein, I discussed marriage and the duties of marriage and the promise and beauty of marriage. And how it is a perfect occasion for a man to die to himself and to work out his problems with his wife. That's what we were talking about. Now, in 1973, though, Al when he died in 2007, he had killed a woman, Phyllis Bowman. She was 23 years old at the time. This was a horrible time in all our lives, says the sister. She had 3 young children. 8 months after she was murdered, her first husband, the father of her 2 older children, was killed in a car wreck on Mount Eagle Mountain. Those children grew up with no mother and no father because of this evil man, referring to Al Schwartz. How does someone who deliberately shot another person 3 times and then bury her body qualify for good behavior? The justice system is more worried about the right of criminals than the rights of victims. My sister was the main victim, she says, but her entire family was victimized. He had been sentenced for a murder to between 5 and 10 years, and he served, she says, a very few years because of good behavior. So that's Al Schwartz. And now sitting before me in 1995, his house. Now, 2 years after we bought the house from Al and his wife, they had moved to another house in Saudi Daisy, and then they moved, I think, on to Lookout Mountain where he had family. And in the last day of his life, which is much like the last day in the life of John Robert Newman. Robert Newman is the man who killed the son, local man, Rick Davis. The son's name is Kevin Lawson, I think 46 years old, killed yesterday in a massacre at a factory that makes awnings for sports vehicles, SUVs, campers, and the like. A vast complex bigger than a couple of football fields, according to media accounts. So John Robert Newman killed those people he hated and resented, just as Al Schwartz, the man who sat before me there on the front porch of his house, killed a woman, 23 years old. Her name was Holly Miners. At the time of his killing her, Al Schwartz was 59 years old. The girl was 23. According to the Chattanooga.com, which has both of these stories on its website, I'm reminding that, and I did not know when I met the Schwartzes anything about this past, that he had killed this woman. But in the killing that was marked by his suicide, here's what happened. Schwartz had kidnapped Holly's sister. Okay, the man killed a woman, right? But first he kidnapped the slain woman's sister, Beth Miners, and he forced her at gunpoint out of her house on Timesville Road at 9 p.m. He said he took her to a wooded area. The officer, who's been quoted, took her to a wooded area on Signal Mountain, made her get out of the vehicle and walk about 15 or 20 feet, and then kneel down and cover her head with a jacket. She was then told to give a reason why he should not kill her. Ultimately, she was forced back into the car and driven to the JC Towers on ML King, 500 ML King, where she jumped out and ran, yelling at her sister to run also. Beth Miners, that's the girl who was not killed, just stood there, and Schwartz grabbed her. He began driving with her on Highway 27 North after getting on at Morrison Springs Road. Officer Rice said Holly spoke with Beth by phone, telling her her location. Police were notified, and they caught up with a Ford Explorer 1994 model and saw a shot being fired and a window shattered. A short distance later, Schwartz stopped the vehicle, and officers saw him shoot himself in the head. Before she died, Holly was able to climb out of the Explorer, run towards officers, and then collapse on the highway. Both victims were dead at the scene, and their bodies were taken to a medical examiner's office. Holly Miners had been shot in the neck and jaw area, and then she died of her injuries. So that's how Al Schwartz and we made much of that house, and we still live there. But the house in which I live was sold by a man who was a murderer, a multiple murderer, and a suicide. And we want to think just briefly about the suicide phenomenon. It is something that rises in a society such as ours. I would say it's a society that has in its heart, it has alienation, incoherence. It has vast inauthenticity, and is probably marked in the most important sense by its religious ideals. It is a society that does not have God, but has purely human constructs as its deity. Right? Men worship their constructs. They don't worship stones and carved wood pieces as the primitives did back in biblical times. They worship ideas. They worship ideals, even if you will. And so they have this urge to suicide. One of my favorite writers is the sociology head of Harvard University at the time of World War II. He's a man who escaped the 9-gram solution twice. 9 grams is the solution that dissenters in the Soviet Union got. 9 grams is the weight of a .30 caliber bullet, and that was administered to the front of the head by a firing squad. He escaped twice. Lenin and his enthusiasm, right, and made it to the United States. He was a sociologist, and his book is The Crisis of Our Age. It's a book that's been through several editions, never has been updated. And I think I may have, let's see, what year. My copy is from the Baptist Missionary Training School, by the way, the 1946 edition, and it's in its 10th printing even then. So it's been in from 41 to 46 through 10 printings. And it's a remarkable book. It's an academic work, but it has remarkable insight into the you might say the cultural ties of a 500-year quest, you might say, of humanity away from ideational culture, as he says, to sensate culture. We're a culture today in Hamilton County in Chattanooga, which is sensate as opposed to ideational. Ideational is one that is controlled by God and religion, right? It is about ideas. It is about service to God, service to God's law, and worshiping God, and thereby affecting human beings around you in worshiping God. What we have now is we've gone about as far as we can go in the other direction, which is towards sensate. And sensate culture, Piterim Sorokin says, that's his name, Sorokin, if you want to put it in English. I say Piterim Sorokin because I think that's how the Russians would say it. He says that in our day, which is marked by the rise of the total state, right, the total welfare, surveillance, and warfare state, we have this removal of men from themselves. We have an encouragement and a feeding of not just, he doesn't mention terrorism, but terrorism comes from the same form of we might say religious error, as does mass murder, whether it's Eric Klebold in Columbine School, or Al Schwartz with his murder-suicide, or the man who killed John Robert Newman, the man who killed Rick Davis's son in Florida, and 4 others, and himself, right, and then wounded 7 others. That's what happened in Florida, in Orlando. Yet, not. It's some distance from the theme park, by the way. So the blood spattering is not upon the famous Disney brand, but merely on the floor of that factory and on the carpeting in the hallway there. There is an urge to suicide, and I'm giving an analysis that I don't know that I can repeat what I've already said about it, and I'm sorry that I'm giving you the short form here, but I think it's important just to mention where this comes from and what it's about. And I've got Sorokin, to use the American pronunciation, to tell you. I want to try to give you the sense of what his argument is. It's about psychosocial isolation. Okay, that's where we have murder suicide. There's a remarkable dignity of the suicide. Right, a man kills himself because he's solving his problem. There's a great dignity in killing yourself, right? Because you're sacrificing yourself for a cause, and you're hopeless, and yet there you have the greatest hope. You have the greatest hope in this self-defeating, self-abnegating act of pulling the trigger against your own temple. It is an existential act. It is an act of remarkable courage, and you could argue that it's courage or cowardice. It's really both. It's both at the same time. That's why it is reflective of the incoherence of our day. We have an incoherence, a cultural incoherence, and in my analysis is local economy and the free market. That's what I do. David Tulis here, the editor of Nooganomics.com, the website for the man who matters, where we go into the deep questions in a very easy and approachable way. I'll have you know, the deep questions of local economy and the free market. The culture and the economy that we have are causative. I would say they're causative and contributory. They contribute to what happened to Rick Davis's son in that factory. That is to say, murder-suicide. The goal was suicide. The approach, the method was mass murder to get there, to solve the problem, right? To make things courageous, to make things to have your suicide to be an existential act. It disregards completely all moral right and wrong. It disregards God. It disregards truth. It disregards circumstances, and you become the most human according to existential theory. It's a system of philosophy that Jean-Paul Sartre, the Frenchman, devised back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. You become the most human at the moment of the existential act, and that's almost always something violent. Albert Camus' character in The Stranger does that, killing an unknown Arab on a beach. In that very wonderful and weird novel that college freshmen read, and that students in their second year French class read because it's written in such simple French. The Stranger, and we've all become strangers, and we've been made strangers by the rise of the modern total state. And it's by design, right? These things are not by accident that we're turned into these sort of automatons, these soulless beings where in whose minds and in whose hearts everything is disconnected. In fact, public schools teach disconnection. The whole idea of the school is not the content of the class, but the fact of schooling itself, the continual drumbeat of disconnection of every segment being of equal value, right? Your science is of equal value to your poetry, equal value to your civics class, equal value to your history class, equal value to your typing class, equal value to sports, equal value to lunch, equal value to the pep rally, and so on. There's nothing can ever consume your interest, and everything is made equal. Everything is made disconnection. Disconnection is what's taught by modern culture. And Sorokin, in his analysis, sees the slaying of the Davis son, a man in his 40s and an accomplished businessman, no doubt like his father. And he says, we have seen how the contractual ties of all of our institutions have been steadily weakening. Quantitative and qualitative decline of the family means a corresponding increase of psychosocial isolation. And that, he says, is accentuated by a decline in the contractual relations in economic, political, and labor, and in other occupational organizations. Modern man, in his quest for sensate liberty, has been severing most of his social bonds with his fellows. And here now we see humanism at its very best, right? Humanism, which rejects God's law. He has succeeded well. At the beginning of this century, he was as free as a feather floating in the air. Like the proverbial butterfly, he flitted from one group to another. He married today only to be divorced tomorrow. He associated himself momentarily now with this and now with that occupation, or with this or that religious, political, or business group. But all these associations, as a rule, were conditional, limited, temporary, and superficial. They rarely afforded an intimate union for life. They provided not the traditional home sweet home, but merely a species of temporary pied-à-terre. Pied-à-terre is French for foot on the earth, right? Temporary land there, right? In your marriage, in your relationships, in your job, in your calling, in your religion, in your purpose. This is the beginning of the purposeless man, the inauthentic Facebook man, right? This is the Facebook man. They provided not the traditional home sweet home. They could not satisfy, he says, the lonely heart. Like narcotics, they could give only a momentary illusion of intimate and genuine unity. No real or abiding psychological or psychosocial attachment. The individual was indeed free, but he found himself in a psychosocial vacuum where he did not know what to do with his freedom. Like a hungry millionaire in the desert, he could not buy anything with his freedom, which presently turned out to be a burden rather than an asset. And he goes on, this page I opened simply at random, okay, in this 1946 edition, Crisis in Our Age. Similar isolation, he says, and ennui is boredom, were engendered by the incessant expansion of his desires and lusts, by the consequent multiplication of the means of their satisfaction. In the preceding chapter, it was pointed out that there is no limit to sensory desires, that the more one has, the more one wants, of course, fueled by credit. The painful discrepancy between what one had and what one wanted grew ever wider, and more one strove to obtain his objective, the more evanescent it became, the more fleeting, right? The more, the more diaphanous. Sooner or later, this hopeless quest produced a sense of weariness and fatigue. Vanitas vanitatum, vanity of vanities, from the book of Ecclesiastes. Life began to appear as somewhat distasteful, as something distasteful, empty, and futile. A few moments of pleasure turned out to be a passing illusion. Disappointment and ennui were reinforced by the conflicts and animosities and antagonists bred by the ruthless violation of the rights of others and by the injuries inflicted upon others by the search for sensory happiness. And thus, one found himself a stranger, not only a stranger to almost everything else, but a stranger living in a psychosocial vacuum surrounded by enemies and antagonists. That's the killer right there. That's Alvin Schwartz. That is John Robert Newman, the killer in Orlando. His psychosocial isolation was well not complete. The sequel was inevitable, a mounting wave of suicide and mental derangement. And this analysis, of course, doesn't give you the context of the modern state. The modern state breaks up everything. The modern state atomizes a people who don't have God. That's what happens. If people don't have God, they have an atomized individual life, and Everything is private and personal. Think of how social media that we hear about is doing that. It makes everybody isolated. Well, this is David Tulis, and I do thank you for giving me a minute of your time. There's going to be at 1 o'clock today a terrific interview between Mike Steele from our station. And the question is climate change, fraud, or scam? Climate change. Is it a fraud, or is Al Gore right? Is Trump and his politicking right, that it's just a joke and a con? Or is it a legitimate threat to humanity? 1 o'clock here at Nooga Radio. 1 o'clock, the climate change fraud with a well-known meteorologist and scientist here from Chattanooga, David Tulis.
The Tennessee Valley's news, talk, and sports leader. Nooga Radio, AM 1240 and 92.7 FM.